Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about the emergence of Dungeons and Dragons' own Oppenheimer, the Oppenheimer of Dungeons and Dragons. In my humble opinion, that person is DnDdeepDives. It's the Dungeons and Dragons commentator, DnDdeepDives, and I want to talk about what he's doing and why it's so incredibly destructive. And we're about to get Christopher Nolan's story of Oppenheimer. And how Oppenheimer saw what he had wrought, saw what he had built, and had massive regret, just like wept for humanity for the thing he had built. He only asked if he could. He never asked if he should. And now we see Dungeons and Dragons' own Oppenheimer, who, in my humble opinion, is specifically the Dungeons and Dragons of the Oppenheimer of Dungeons and Dragons is specifically. DnDdeepDives, who has his own channel, does exactly what I do every day, right, and commentates on D&D, but in a very unique and, frankly, in my opinion, destructive to the Dungeons & Dragons community way. All right, so let's get into this. So basically, here's my supposition. Narrative over everything, okay? The problems we have in Dungeons & Dragons is because we have too many Dungeon Masters, too many Dungeons & Dragons designers focusing on damage. How much damage can your character do? It is the most useless, the most fruitless, the most wasteful focus. It is the most wasteful thing you could put your time, energy, and focus on. And take a look at the Dungeon Dudes, right? So I push people over to the Dungeon Dudes all the time. People come up here and are like, "Oh, Scott, I'm so unhappy with these things you're saying. They don't match anything else I see or anywhere else. Nobody else is saying this. I don't like what you're saying, right? And it makes me uncomfortable." And I'm like, no problem. Calm down. Shove over to the Dungeon Dudes. They'll get you back on track. They'll talk about subclasses, and your Warlock needs to deal 2d2 when it casts this spell. And here's how you get a plus d4. We're going to talk about 20 minutes about how you get a plus d4 damage, right? It's incredibly, they are mechanically focused, right? They do not care, in my humble opinion, one iota about narrative. They'll talk about it every now and then, but it's less than 5 to 10% of their content. They do not talk about narrative. They talk about mechanics of Dungeons and Dragons. Oh, and let me catch you before you say it. Scott, the mechanics and the narrative are together. And and you can make sure that your mechanics actually walk into the narrative and go hand in hand with the narrative. No, you can't, right? Narrative above everything, right? And the reason why I'm calling this out, and I continue to call this out, is there is a prejudice at every single table across at the macro level. There is a prejudice with dungeon masters and players who are saying you are sitting over there playing your character, and you need to do everything possible to squeeze out another 1d4 of damage. And if you don't do it, and you do anything to make the narrative of your character interesting, I will castigate you and call you out. This just happened to me. I even hinted, right, that I would run a suboptimal build. It melted the thread on the D&D group I was at. I went home and I had to scroll through for a minute and a half, just to see the beginning of the text, right? People really care about damage, right? And so what I'm saying is the correct amount, you should be 25% mechanically focused and 70% narrative focused, and you should at every turn of the game be willing to sacrifice mechanical advantage for narrative advantage, right? And no one is saying this. No one is saying this on the internet. I am very, very confident you're not going to hear this anywhere else, right? So D&D deep dives, right? So I actually think that the mechanical focus of the Dungeon Dudes is destructive to the D&D community because it puts their time, energy, and focus in the exact wrong place, right? So the macro level effect of them is destructive, not creative, right? It's just my humble opinion, right? Come at me in the comments if you think I'm wrong, right? And it is a destruction that deals with an intellectual concept. It's not physically destructive in any way. It's just destructive to intellect, creativity, and someone's to their emotions and their intellect. Just destructive in that way only, right? But I don't think that's a small thing. I think it's important, right? Well, the Dungeon Dunes have been far surpassed by the DnDdeepDive commentator. And what he just did was he created the invisible hypnotist. And so he created he did the entire video, and then he did a short, and he said, I know your Dungeon Master is going to counter this, right? Like, and he literally did a short, a double tap on his, like, your DM's going to come to counter this. And the reason why is I just showed you how to create a character that does three things, right? That buffs your party, is never detected themselves, so they can't generally be, is almost never detected themselves, so they can't be hit, and counters specifically the bad guys, right? Counters the bad guys' main abilities, right? Makes it so that the villain, the monsters and the villains in the game, their main powers and their main abilities are countered, not even reduced, like countered, right? So this build I just made counters villains and monsters, but buffs every other player character, and makes it sure that your player character isn't even a target, right? That sounds super unfun, super gamey, super gimmicky, super optimized, and everything that's wrong with Dungeons & Dragons today, right? And he built it. He Oppenheimer did, right? And he knows he's going to be haunted by what he's wrought, right? He knows that what he created is a problem for 10,000 Dungeon Masters who are going to have 1 to 5 to maybe even 1 to 5 sessions where everything's off kilter until they figure out how to deal with this horrible monster beast he built. This detonating device, this virtual detonating, it's a campaign detonating device. It's a build that will detonate your campaign, all right? It is there to destroy narrative, destroy balance among the player characters, and destroy campaigns, Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. He knows that Dungeon Masters are going to have to counter this, because he did a short saying, do not be surprised when your Dungeon Master comes to counter this, right? Because of what I've built, right? He already has his brimmed hat putting above his eyes because he cannot look people in the eye for what he's doing, right? He knows, in my humble opinion, that what he is doing is horribly wrong, and he has built a virtual campaign detonating device, right? And he knows there are thousands of players and thousands of Dungeon Masters he's about to not disrupt, but completely knock prone, right? And some campaigns will not survive, right? There will be players at the table who are like, I built this, I copied this, you now need to make sure that all your villains and all your monsters fall to my copy energy, right? And don't you dare tank me. Don't you tank this build. You sit in your Dungeon Master place and you serve up your monsters and your villains for me to counter their best abilities, for me to buff everybody at the table, and for me to never even be a target of your monsters. And don't you dare get out of that seat. You're not here to tell a narrative. You're not here to do anything that brings joy. You're here to roll on your silly little random generator, put anything from the MM in front of the monster manual in front of me, and I will knock it down, and I will buff everybody else, and they will glorify me, and you are nothing, Dungeon Master. You are nothing. Get in your sad sack position and serve up the next monster, you ridiculous, useless fool. That's what he's doing. He's provisioned it for thousands of players. He has created a virtual campaign detonating device, right? And he knows it. The short proves he knows what he's doing. He is the Oppenheimer of Dungeons & Dragons, in my humble opinion. Every single word of that is my humble opinion. What's important is when I get to hear your humble opinion, when you get in the comments and send your traffic. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.